Good morning, everyone. It is 10 o'clock, so we're going to get started here. Welcome to our second installment of our Water Quality Wednesday webinar series. Today, we're going to talk about cover crop resources, herbicide considerations, and interactions with water quality. And before we begin, I want to mention a few events that we have coming up. Our final Water Quality Wednesday of the season will be next month, March 29th at the same time, 10 to 11:30 a.m. We'll be talking about wetlands and a brief H2 Ohio update. And then April 3rd, we have another CLM webinar in our CLM webinar series, and we'll be talking about grazing livestock with cover crops. So for both Water Quality Wednesday and our CLM series, our recorded sessions can be found on the OSU Agronomy YouTube channel, and we'll drop a link to that in the chat here in a little bit. But you can register for either of those upcoming sessions at the links here down below, which is go.osu.edu/CLM or WQW. We also have a few in-person events coming up, including the Overholt Drainage School in Worcester, March 13th through 17th. I think Vinayak is going to talk a little bit about that. And then March 14th and 15th, we have the Conservation Tillage Conference in Ada, Ohio. For more info, you can go to the Allen Soil and Water website. I'm your host this morning. My name is Rachel Cochran. I'm a Water Quality Extension Associate, and I cover Paulding, Defiance, and Van Wert counties. And today we're going to have three speakers. One of our speakers, Amber Emmons, is another member of the OSU water quality team. She's going to talk about herbicides and cover crops. Then we'll have Vinayak Shedekar. He is an assistant professor here at OSU, and he's going to talk a little bit about water quality and cover crops. And then to round out the webinar, we'll have Brittany Hanrahan, who is with USDA-ARS. She's a research biologist in soil drainage, and she's going to also talk about some of her research. And we'll follow up with a Q&A session at the very end. Before we get started, I also want to introduce our water quality team to those of you who may not be familiar with us. We cover the entire Western Lake Erie Basin, and we are a 6-person team. As I said, I cover Paulding, Defiance, and Van Wert counties. If we go north, we have Courtney Krieger. She covers Williams, Fulton, and Lucas counties. We have Amber Emmons, who covers Henry, Wood, and Ottawa counties. We have Matthew Romanko, who covers Sandusky, Erie, Seneca, Wyandotte, and Crawford counties. Paige Garabrandt covers Putnam, Hancock, and Hardin. And Jocelyn Burt, our newest water quality associate, covers Mercer, Auglaize, and Allen counties. We have our website link here on the screen if you're interested in seeing some of our work. And before we introduce our speakers, I want to briefly talk about a new resource that just came out, a series of Ohio cover crop fact sheets. This is a collaboration between the Midwest Cover Crops Council and Ohio State University Extension. This series covers 23 different species of cover crops, including grasses, brassicas and broadleaves, and legumes. And here's a list of the species. I'm not going to go through it because there's a lot of them, but they're all on the screen here. They cover a bunch of information, including identification information, cultural traits, planting information, and performance information. So for identification, they talk about the differences in the identifying features. So how do I tell apart wheat from triticale? Cultural traits, is it a winter annual or a summer annual? What the minimum germination temperature is for each species, and if that species has preferences for shade, flooding, does it survive the winter, etc. For planting information, we cover planting dates, the rates by planting method, so whether that's broadcast with incorporation or without, or aerial seeding, and how many seeds are in each pound. But an important note is that this planting information tells you the dates that these species can be planted for establishment. So the date range is the range in which the research has shown these species will establish. So the dates and the rates are going to be different than what's required for conservation programs through your soil and water conservation districts and NRCS. So if you're looking into those conservation practices, make sure you're looking only at NRCS Appendix A for the seeding rates and the date ranges to ensure that you're following your contract. And for performance, what is this species good at? Is it good for scavenging nitrogen? Is it good for building soil? Does it fight weeds? Does it grow quickly? And what type of biomass does the species produce? In addition, it has termination information and potential advantages and disadvantages. So what are those methods of termination and the considerations for each? And what are some additional tips and tricks? And for termination, make sure you're following any date requirements for crop insurance or any other programs that you're enrolled in. For potential advantages, how do these species affect the soil? Is there any disease resistance? Is there any weed competition? And for disadvantages, what are those potential risks for each species and how big of a risk are they? So how can you access these fact sheets? So they're now housed on the Midwest Cover Crops Council website, which is just simply midwestcovercrops.org. That's a new website. They used to be housed within the MSU website, but now they have their own. And I'll drop that in the chat as well in a little bit. But once you go to that Midwest Cover Crops Council website, you'll hover over the state provinces button in the middle of the screen. You'll click Ohio, and then you'll select down here where it says Ohio Cover Crop Fact Sheets. And you'll go to a link that has each one linked to the same page. So now I'll turn it over to Amber Emmons, who's going to discuss herbicides and cover crops. And I will stop my screen share so she can share. Thanks, Amber. It looks great.
Awesome. Okay. I'm glad that came up correctly. So yeah, Rachel introduced me. My name is Amber Emmons. Like she said, I'm a water quality extension associate. I do cover Wood, Henry, and Ottawa counties, and I'm going to be going over today the herbicide considerations when using cover crops. There are several things to consider when you're going to use cover crops in your system. And most of the times, if you're using herbicides, you need to consider your herbicide label. You need to know what you're going to apply and how that could affect what cover crop species you're going to choose later in the year. So you need to have an idea of what cover crops then you're going to select. And you also need to consider before going into this, are you going to graze any of this? Is there rotational grazing? Are you cutting any of these to be feed later? There's just several things that you have to consider before you're going to just go ahead and plant cover crops. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the herbicide carryover facts. So you're going to want to know your label. And this is it can be tedious. There's a lot of herbicides. There's a lot of different labels. They're not all written the same, but you need to know the label guidelines. The herbicides with residuals, they can cause established effects depending on if you're using a residual herbicide that controls grasses. That's great in your system. You're going to have longer weed control. But if it's going to prevent grasses from germinating, then it can have an effect possibly on your grass cover crop species. Same with broadleaves. If you're going to use a residual, consider how long it's going to take for that herbicide to go away so you can plant those broadleaves. You also have to keep in mind, like I'm talking about, the rotational intervals, and I'll show you some examples of this in the next couple slides. But on these labels, they'll tell you how long you should wait to plant something based on when you applied this herbicide. And the last thing is, depending on the weather for that year, the weather can affect how long that residual herbicide persists in your soil. If you have a drier year, it's going to persist longer. If you have a wetter year, it can possibly go away sooner. We're looking at that chart in the bottom. This is from a Take Action website. We're looking at time across the bottom. So as time goes on, we're going to the right. We're going to look at the concentration of the herbicide that's there in your field as it goes up. So that top line that's the minimum concentration you need to get for weed control. That's usually the amount you're applying, or sometimes you apply over that amount, depending on the weeds or resistance you have. That's what you're going to apply because you want to get control of the weeds in your field. Now, if we get to the bottom line, that's the maximum concentration that can be in the field that's safe for crops to be replanted depending on the species. So what needs to happen in the season is, after you've applied, you need to get your herbicide down from that top level down to the bottom level for you to have no issues with establishment when you plant your cover crops. So not every label is the same, like I mentioned. They're written up differently. The way they say what crops they cover, the way they say what weeds they control, they're all kind of written up differently. There's certain sections they're required to have, but they're all can look different. Like here's a couple of examples. If you apply Roundup Power Max 3, which is glyphosate, if you go under the cereal section, it's just going to have this little thing that says restrictions. And application, if you're going to apply, must be made 30 days prior to planting any kind of cereal grain or any crop that's not listed. And then it has the same thing, but a little bit more if you're going to apply any legumes. Again, the restriction is a minimum of 30 days between the application if you're going to plant any kind of legume. This is more of just a paragraph format. You're not going to find any nice table. You just got to read into it and kind of sit down, read their label, and find out what you need. Now, if you're looking at something like metolachlor or dual magnum 2, they apply this nice little chart. Like if I'm going to plant alfalfa, I can't plant it until 4 months after my application date. Otherwise, there may be issues. I can't plant oats, barley, rye, or wheat for 4.5 months. I can't plant buckwheat or rice until the next spring. These are just things you got to kind of know what you're going to plant and how long until it's safe to plant those again. Another 2 examples that look, again, kind of similar but kind of different. For peroxysulfone or focus is an example. They have a little chart as well, but they're going to show that field peas, sunflowers, wheat, or some other cover crops you may use, you can plant immediately. It's not going to have an effect on those. Whereas something like barley, canola, your mustard, your oats, durum wheats, they want you to wait a full year, full 12 months after your application date before you should plant those safely. Now, Rancor metribuzin is another, just throwing out examples here. There's another chart, looks a little bit different, but it's the same information. If you're planting winter cereals, you should wait about 4 months. If you're going to plant some kind of rice, maybe you need to wait 10 months. It's just something that you're going to have to sit down and read your label, because every herbicide may be different and how they report it may be different as well. Some of the factors that get into whether there's going to be issues with your herbicide carryover is the application timing and method. When did you apply this? Was this something applied early spring before emergence? Was this something you came back and made a post application? Because those 2 different dates, whether it's sometime in like March or April versus July, can have an effect of when that 10 months or when that 4 months is up and when I can plant something safely. Also, tillage can have an effect on whether the herbicide resides in that soil longer. Usually some form of tillage can help in the breakdown of that herbicide and get rid of it sooner. No-till, though, can have it increase because you're not doing anything out of that soil. That herbicide may stay there longer. Some of the external factors, the herbicide itself, depending on what its chemical makeup is and how its structure, that's just herbicide dependent. And that's something, again, that's going to be in those labels that you need to determine for yourself when it's going to break down. Your soil characteristics is something that's going to be field by field basis and could be different for each farmer, could be different for different fields the farmer owns. Soils that have more organic matter or clay content tend to have more carryover. The herbicides persist in those heavy soils longer. If you have a very low or a very high pH, usually the ends of the spectrum versus where we try and be is in the middle of the neutral zone, you can have more or less degradation depending on how far you are away from that neutral zone. But those warm, fertile, again, aerated soils, and if you have that close to neutral pH, those are the soils that are going to have the best breakdown of herbicides in a timely manner. And like I said earlier, weather is very dependent. It's what you can't control. But a warmer summer, a warmer spring with more rainfall, that herbicide is going to break down and leave your system sooner. Whereas cooler temperatures, a cool spring, and you're not getting any rain in the fall, those herbicides could then stick around a lot longer than you think. So I'm going to reference a couple things from this fact sheet that was put out by Alyssa Esman, Mark Laux, and Bill Johnson. A lot of other weed scientists from across the United States also contribute to this. It's a fact sheet they put out with research from their own trials and tried to gather everything from across the United States into this one fact sheet. It's to take action fact sheets for cover crops for weed management, covers herbicide persistence and carryover for cover crops. And so the next 2 slides are charts directly from that fact sheet. So they have a couple of these nice charts, really nice. Again, this is all from research they've done or that has been done at their universities. So this is all research-based and backed. So if you look at any of the herbicides, you're looking at 2,4-D, tells you the group number, for an example, and it tells you in the fall what cover crops are safe to plant. So for 2,4-D, all grasses are safe to plant. I could plant any kind of grass species and it'd be great. And then if the fall cover crops that have a potential for injury, it might not, but there is that potential is something like 30 days before sensitive broadleaves. So this is one thing where instead of, you should always go to your label, but it's one way to kind of double check, or if you can't find it, or if you're not sure, this chart can kind of help with that. If you look for the active ingredient of your herbicide, And then they'll tell you based on the research across the United States, what's safe to plant and what could have the potential for injury. This is just the rest of that chart. You can see something like clethodim, all broadleaves are safe to plant, but there is none that they think that would have potential for injury, at least if you're waiting 30 days after an application. Silventicil, so group number 14, all cover crops are again safe to plant, and there's none that they know of potential injury. That's just how you read these charts, and again, they're very helpful if you can't find or don't know how to read your labels. Now going on to choosing your cover crops that can have an effect on your herbicide carryover. You got to have an idea of what you're going to plant in order to know how that herbicide may affect it. So the cover crop selections, different herbicides affect different species differently. Herbicides that control broadleaves typically have an effect or can have an effect on broadleaf cover crop species. Same thing with grass herbicides. Grass herbicides can affect grass cover crop species potentially. So this is from multiple states in a study. They found that herbicide carryover affected tillage radish the greatest overall and cereal rye the least. So what I'm saying is the tillage radish was the most sensitive to herbicides and the cereal rye was the least sensitive, with your crimson clover, annual ryegrass, and your winter wheat and winter oats being about in the middle. And each step is a step down. And this is what they found overall from multiple states. And again, this is like I'm saying, broadleaf cover crops can be affected by the broadleaf herbicides. So your group 2 is your ASL and ALS inhibitors, your group 5, your photosystem 2 inhibitors, your group 14, your PPO inhibitors, and your group 27, your HPPD inhibitors. And your grass cover crop species, typically any residual grass herbicide has the potential to affect grass cover crop species. In this picture, you can see this is taken from some of that Take Action or Purdue University's fact sheets. You can see that in this mix, there's several different species in this cover crop mix. Looks like your grass species are doing pretty well and they're fine. Whereas you can see some of those broadleaves, there must have been something applied in that system that's affecting the broadleaves. So overall, this is from the University of Missouri, and they found that in some of their studies, the most injurious soybean herbicides are from Savin, which is your Flexstar, Previx, Sulventrazone, your Authority products, Peroxysulfone, which is something like Azidua or Anthem, your Amazathorpe is your Pursuit, and your Acetochlor, which is your Harness, Degree, Suppress, Warrant. These is just what they found, and these are the ones that found that persisted the longest or could have the most effect on cover crops. Again, from the University of Missouri, but just the other side now, these are the ones that they found that when they used these herbicides in corn, they had the most effect on cover crops. So you're looking at Trebenzazone, which is your Armezone or Impact. Again, Peroxysulfone, your Zidua or Anthem. Your Mesotrione, which is your Calypso 4L. Your Caloparolid, Stinger, Hornet, Resicor. Isofluxetol, your Balance Pro, your Bloxlex, or nickel sulfuron, your Accent 75DF. Again, these are just examples. Depending on that weather conditions or your soil types, you could see herbicides that have more of an effect than these. So they did this study for 3 years in Missouri, and they found that you can see the orange represents where they didn't have any reduction in any year. They never found any impact. They were fine. The light beige or salmon color, depending on your screen, looks kind of, at least one of the 3 years of the study, they did see a reduction. And if they used a black box, then at least in 2 or 3 years, they did see reductions or did have impacts. So you can see in the winter wheat, the impact had an effect on the winter wheat and the winter oats. Your Balance had the most impact on your tillage radish, at least in some of the years. The Stinger impacted the crimson clover. Your Accent Q also affected the winter wheat. The Helix GT affected annual ryegrass. And then that Zidua or Peroxysulfone affected your winter oats and your annual ryegrass as well. This is some of the pictures from that study that I pulled. You can see in the different photos whether there was an impact on how it germinated, whether it's hardly anything germinated, they didn't get a good stand, or if it did germinate and it's fine, but it's giving it some chlorosis, some necrosis, and it's just not looking the healthiest. Now we're going to switch a little bit and go into that grazing aspect. Are you going to use these cover crops as cover crops, or are they going to be more of a forage crop? Because there is a difference. So what is the difference between a forage crop and a cover crop then? Cover crops are generally what you're just using it as a cover. You just need something out there to cover it for the winter, whether you're using it for your soil, to reduce your soil erosion, reduce soil compaction, you want more organic matter, you want it to reduce nutrient runoff, but you're just having it out there, you're not going to use it for anything. You're going to kill it at the end of the season some way then to plant your cash crop. Now, if you're looking at a forage crop, you're going to get those same benefits, the reduced soil erosion, reduced soil compaction, your increased organic matter, reducing your nutrient runoff, etc. But it's something that you're going to graze, or you're going to mechanically harvest it to then feed to livestock. That is the key difference. So if you're looking at that, then you're also going to need to go to your labels and look at the grazing restrictions because of that forage versus cover crop difference. There can be differences in the plant back restrictions when you're going to use a forage crop, not a cover crop. This is done because they usually have a longer time period before you can plant a forage crop, because they're worried about that bioaccumulation of herbicides in the forage, because you're going to feed it to a livestock animal. If you're using it as a cover crop, it's not a big deal. We can plant it, it'll grow safely. You're going to terminate it at the end of the year. It's just going to be used as cover and organic matter. Whereas if you're going to feed it to a livestock, that bioaccumulation of that herbicide could be at a level yet potentially that could harm the livestock. So they've usually increased that rotation interval. Cover crops can be planted before that restriction interval is up, if there is only a grazing restriction interval, because you're not going to graze it or you're not going to harvest it for feed. But if you're going to use it as a forage crop again, or if there's any chance you may change your mind and use it as a forage crop, then you should wait. So that's just some herbicide considerations. Thank you for listening to my talk. If you would scan that QR code, this is how we get some of our feedback on our teachings. If we get any comments about what I should do different, what I should do the same, and I'll post a link up in the chat after this. I appreciate you listening to me. And that's my contact information. Thanks.
Thanks, Amber. That was great. If anybody has questions for Amber, please enter those in the Q&A box. We will do a panel type Q&A session at the very end after Brittany has presented. So now we're going to turn it over to Vinayak, and he's going to start the conversation about water quality and cover crops.
Thank you, Rachel. If you can just bear with me, I accidentally deleted one slide that I was trying to present. So, and I did fix it. I'm just trying to do the slideshow now.
No problem.
Okay. You can confirm that you're seeing the right screen.
Yes, it looks great.
All right. Well, thank you again. Good morning, everyone, whoever is on the call. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the drainage aspects as it relates to cover crops. I think Rachel did put in a plug for the drainage school that's coming up during the spring break of Ohio State. We're going to be in Worcester starting March 13th. The registration closes at the end of this month on February 28th. So with that, we're talking about drainage, and I can't start my presentation without this slide. We all very much know that how important drainage is for sustaining crop production here in the Midwest, including a majority of the Ohio. So just to put things in perspective, here is a map that shows the percentage of county areas that are under drainage or that have received some kind of drainage in our region. And you can see that Northwest Ohio particularly tends to be one of the most intensively drained landscapes in the Midwest. So just to highlight the fact that we cannot even imagine crop production if it wasn't for drainage. Of course, our parameters are starting to change, and as the cropping systems are evolving. But if we kind of go back in the history a little bit, that shows us many different aspects of drainage, which includes the primary thing that we should be probably looking at today is the what are the benefits of drainage. And I didn't have to reinvent um, the information. This uh, bulletin was written in the year that I was born, in I think 1982. The drainage extension educator at the time, Mel Palmer, wrote this bulletin, and it's very relevant even in today's world. There is many benefits. He basically listed 20 benefits of drainage, which started from the improvements that you start seeing in the soils, and then talks about many other aspects that you can think of. Of course, in from a farmer's perspective, the most important benefit that you can think of is what is that benefit to the crop productivity, the economics, and then I'm going to highlight some of that today, and then we're going to transition into the cover crops just to quickly go through this. The initial drainage research that was conducted here in Ohio and the Midwest mainly focused on really comparing a typically undrained plot or land with different levels of drainage intensity. And essentially the work of drainage starts when you're trying to provide some kind of surface drainage just to get rid of the surface runoff water. But then you can incorporate subsurface drainage or more of a combination of surface and subsurface drainage. So those are the 4 treatments that you're seeing here. This was research done by Professor Glenn Schwab between 1958 and 1982. And what you see here is it's very obvious. Nobody needs convincing on this anymore, but drainage clearly does provide the yield benefit. One thing that we tend to ignore is the fact that drainage also helps stabilize those yields. So of course, the columns that you see are the yield in bushels per acre. But if you look at the shaded area behind those bars is the variability, the interannual variability in the crop yield. So for example, here for an undrained plot over that period of about 22 years, the corn yield was anywhere between 60 plus or minus 60 bushels per acre. And as you go towards the drainage treatments, that variability goes down significantly. You don't eliminate that variability. It's not a exact same yield across the board. You still have the variability because of the variations in your weather patterns from one year to another. But this is one of the key benefits of drainage, is the fact that it kind of helps you take the risk out of the equation as it relates to your water stresses. The benefit is even more enhanced if you add irrigation to the equation. So again, just then as an example, this was research done on sub-irrigation component being added to the system, and about 53 bushel benefit or response in corn and 9 bushel response in soybean if you add irrigation to the equation. And again, this was sub-irrigation. So here is kind of putting it all together, the last several decades of drainage research in your perspective. Long time ago, we established the fact that the drainage, subsurface drainage does provide benefit to crop yield. But then adding the irrigation component or a controlled drainage component also helps further enhance those yields, depending upon, and then it takes a little bit of a management at that point. So just keep these thoughts in mind. Of course, I also want to remind you the golden rule of drainage, which states that drain only what is necessary for good trafficability and crop growth, and not a single drop more. So essentially what we're talking about is just making sure you have adequate drainage, okay? And this very much applies the same way to when it comes to drainage and cover crops. But then when it comes to cover crops, I think the questions that we're trying to, at least I'm hoping to answer today, are how does drainage interact with cover crops? how should one manage drainage for cover crops, or if we should manage drainage for cover crops, and if or how we should manage cover crops for drainage. So I know I'm maybe sounding more confusing to you now, but hopefully this will all make sense to you in the subsequent slides. Um, Again, going back to that 20 benefits of drainage, this is where you can start looking similar to what it would do for your cash crops. Drainage does provide the same benefits to a winter crop or a cover crop. Uh, if it wasn't for drainage existing in that field, you would be looking at very poor growth of cover crops or almost no growth of cover crops, because it would be a very poorly drained soil or poorly drained soil. Um, and then again, bringing back to that golden rule of drainage, good drainage, there is this fact sheet does mention the good drainage, and it doesn't define what good drainage is, but hopefully you'll get, by the time I end this presentation, you'll get at least some idea what we're talking about. But a lot of this relates to this rule of drainage, but also kind of designing your system that is suitable for the objectives that you have. So if cover crops is one of the objectives, or if cover crops is going to be part of your equation, you might as well start thinking about planning your drainage systems, keeping the cover crops in mind. Now, if you go in Northwest Ohio or majority of the Midwest, the typical depth at which we install drainage is about 3 feet plus or minus. You would see a small acreage that is under shallow drainage, and then there are soils where people are putting in some deep drainage. The map, the figure that you see behind here is all different kinds of cover crop species and their root depths. And then I plotted the blue line is basically where your average drain depth would be. So maybe you need to ask yourself a question whether or not shallow drainage makes sense for your field if you're going to go for cover crops. What are the risks? And if you're thinking of enhancing the cover crop effect, if putting in drainage deeper makes sense for your field. I'm not going to give a recommendation today. The main reason is the depth of drainage and the spacing, they all can't not be determined only based on the fact that whether or not you have cover crops. There are many other factors that come into the design of a drainage system. So, but in general, what my suggestion would be that if you really want to see the deeper crop roots, or at least enhance the growth of crop roots in deeper depths, maybe putting in drain tiles deeper might be a good approach. More important than that, I would recommend that a good quality installation of drainage system would be a key in a field that might see cover crops, and which includes making sure that you have uniform grade. You don't have dips in your laterals when someone is installing them. You do have the drainage technology that is more advanced now that does an excellent job of grade control, but it is still very much operator driven technology. And you just want to make sure you hire the right contractor who has a good track record of installing drainage, and then making sure that you're getting uniform grade across. Maybe if you have the opportunity, maintaining a little bit more steeper grade, especially for your main lines, might be a good idea. If a lateral or two fails, it's easier to fix. If your main fails, that is a more expensive deal. So maybe uniform grade, try to get on steeper side if you're not in a very flat landscape. A majority of failures that we see, especially whether or not with cover crops, is at the connections and joints that are made. So proper joints is another key consideration. And of course, if you're thinking about controlled drainage or drainage water management, then there are additional considerations you may want to think. Another key aspect I would say that might come in the way of your whole soil health evolution for that field or the cover crop establishment for that field is wet spots within the field. Just a tile blowout here and there, or some kind of a failure of a drainage system in the field, and you might want to promptly address those issues. Otherwise, that zone or that field is always going to be lagging behind with respect to whatever you're trying to do. Uh, if you're one of those who are trying to fix the issues on their own, I just wanted to make sure you do it safely. So make sure if you're digging in your farm ground, you definitely want to consider the calling 811 for the utility protection. This question comes very often about the risk of cover crop roots or tree roots clogging tile drains, and there is a lot of good material available online. I did share the links with Rachel. Hopefully she'll be able to put those in the chat for you. But yes, yeah, the cover crop roots do pose a risk of clogging tile drains if they find the entry point in the tile drains. But with whether or not it is cover crops, roots in a tile system or seeing roots in a tile system is very common, especially if you go in spring, you will see some roots that are being washed off. The way the drainage systems are designed, they are on average, they would be able to handle a small amount of root mass that is coming in. A majority of the roots that are coming in are either the roots that found an entry in the tile drain, but they are eventually the roots that die off that will start carrying along that drainage system. And now you can see how that drainage design and installation is important, because if you have a steep enough grade, then you're maintaining water velocities that will essentially flush that system out. Especially in spring, we get plenty of water that runs through these tile drain systems that in general, they should be self-flushing systems. Where you see the roots clogging the tile drains are either roots finding entry at a joint or installation where you're using these couplers, the tap tees that protrude into the drain pipe a little too much than what is necessary, and essentially causing obstruction where the roots then kind of just get stuck and then cause obstruction there. I would highly recommend looking into those resources, the fact sheets, for more information. This is just a lot of times this comes up, and I think as drainage experts, we always point to the fact that it was poorly installed system. I want to explore this topic a little bit more in detail. Controlled drainage or drainage water management is one of the practices that is widely being used. For some of you who don't know what controlled drainage is, it's a practice of raising the outlet elevation, especially during non-growing season. And then that's when you have the cover crops growing during the winter time and the springtime. So it's important to think about controlled drainage as a practice, and then how that can play out a role with cover crops. So the NRCS practice standard 554 recommends that in non-growing season, in any field, you want to set the boards in a control structure so that the water table is about 12 inches below surface. And that's kind of the recommendation from the NRCS if you want to be, if you want to sign up into EQIP type of incentive programs, or even H2 Ohio incentive programs. That is a requirement that you have that between the after harvest until the spring, which means that we need to evaluate whether or not that 12 inches of depth makes sense for cover crops. So should that depth be 1 foot below surface, or what should that depth be? Again, putting this in perspective of where we're talking about setting the board height or raising the water level up to this dotted line here. And now you can see that a majority of these roots, especially in spring, would pretty much get drowned or get underwater if the water table rises up to 12 inches below surface. Okay. So definitely it is a problem. The practice standard does address it. The language in there says always set your outlet elevation about half a foot um, below where the expected root depth is. Unfortunately, there is no way to figure out or what the root depth is in any given day, on any given day in spring. So as a farmer, it's very difficult to make a decision on, well, how do I set these boards up if I don't know where the roots are? Before that, I think we should look into really, is that a problem or not? And unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a lot of literature that talks about the susceptibility of cover crop species to the waterlogging stress. I could get as far as getting some numbers for wheat. If the water table is about 6 inches, within 6 inches from the surface, then it is definitely a problem. You want to, especially for an extended period of time, but anything about a foot or lower is not a major issue for wheat. Wheat has the ability to recover, especially for a short period of waterlogging stress. Regardless of that, in order to make sure that you have good cover crop establishment and growth, my recommendation would be that stay away from that 12-inch water table depth. So we don't have any monitoring study or any field research that we have done so far on this, but we did do a simulation study, and this drain mod model that is mentioned here is very accurate in terms of being able to represent what you would see out in the field. So I essentially took 2 different soil series and ran some drain mod scenarios for about 15 years. So here is where you would have a free drainage mode, no control drainage at all. And then the blue line is what the water table fluctuation would look like on daily basis between January through May. And then this is the surface, and this is as you go deeper into the soil profile. So the drain depth is set at about 3 feet. And you can see the water table after any rain event, the gray lines are rainfall. Any rain event, the water table does go up, but it wants to come back to that 3-foot depth in general. So on average, it is staying at 3 feet. Once in a while in spring, it's going to go up to the surface, come back in a day or two. In a controlled drainage scenario, if you had the weir set at 12 inches, that water table is going to linger around that 1-foot depth. If you set the water table depth or the board height at about 18 inches or 24 inches, then that water table is going to linger around 18 inches. And my recommendation right now, based on this research, is about 18 inches, because you can see that there is, no matter whether you have free drainage or controlled drainage, that water table is going to come up to the surface for a day or 2 or 3. It's just the frequency is greater if you're doing it with controlled drainage. But what I'm suggesting is this wouldn't be a problem for cover crops. This may be a problem for cover crops, especially if you're talking about a wet spring. And just to get that point across, here is how many days, continuous days of saturation you will see in a free drainage mode if you had a essentially the drains flowing free. In any given year, you're looking at 2 or 3 days maximum that you have water table close to the surface. Okay. That number goes up to 16 or 14 or 22. So you can see all 2-digit numbers if you have the weir depth set at 12 inches, but it again drops down to single digits if you simply set the weir at 18 inches. Okay. And this is what you want to see, is only a few days of saturation, even in a controlled drainage scenario, so that cover crop roots are able to grow. And then again, you might want to consider even setting the boards deeper as you go into the season, late spring, so that the cover crop roots have a ability to grow. I'm gonna skip this part. Essentially, this slide talks about the controlled drainage as a practice still providing that benefit, okay? So here is two approaches as a recommendation. If you're someone who has too many control structures, doesn't want to deal with um, any of the risk associated with controlled drainage to cover crops, simply set the boards at 18 inches for that sometime in fall after harvest, and you should be okay for majority of the soils here in Ohio. Uh, if you're someone who likes to be out in the field more often and really keep an eye out on the control structures, you might want to use a more of an active approach. So that dotted line shows where you want to set the boards up. As you go into late February, March, as the cover crop starts growing, it would be a good idea if you were able to lower the water table so that you are encouraging those roots to go deeper. We didn't stop there. Rachel was part of this as well. We actually reached out to some farmers and we said, well, we talked to farmers who've been using cover crops and controlled drainage for about 10 years or so or longer. And most of the producers we talked to seem to be very comfortable with both of the practices. They never, initially they were concerned about the risk of water table being too high for cover crops. But there is many farmers who have gotten to a practice where they don't really see a difference between 12-inch and 18-inch for their fields. But we see a really good trend here in terms of farmers who are wanting to adopt both practices. They do become more comfortable and they've come up with their own way of managing these structures. Some are managing their structures more actively. Some are just setting the boards at a specific height and then they don't have to worry about it for the rest of the season. All right. Controlled drainage, you also want to consider a few other things, especially crop species selection is also important. If manure is going to be part of the equation, then there is guidance on manure and controlled drainage. And then automated control structures, I know they are a little more expensive, but if you had to manage 30, 40 structures on a farm, that adds up pretty quick. So I think automated control drainage does have a place. We just don't know how the price is going to be. Just wanted to put a plug in for the research that we're doing here. No major findings yet, because we're just getting started with automated control drainage research. So I think I did talk enough about the recommendations. There is an article that we wrote in Ohio Country Journal that you can refer to. Now let's flip the coin and say, well, how would you manage cover crops if you have drainage issues or if you have a drainage system? And it's pretty simple, to be honest. Typically a drainage system would have taken care of your wet spots or dry spots, but you might end up having a low spot in a field that tends to remain overly wet. So maybe balancing your cover crop mixes or selecting species, just like Amber was suggesting, that would grow better in a wet spot versus a dry spot might be a good strategy just to maintain a good cover. And then know that, whatever happens above ground, it can be a good indicator of how the below ground growth looks like. Again, I'm bringing this up here as well because that tends to be an important aspect, troubleshooting drainage systems. A lot of people don't know this. I know many people use cover crop selector tool that is available through the Midwest Cover Crop Council. And that tool actually does allow you to tweak for a poorly drained condition. So I zoomed in and looked at a poorly drained soil. So it says drainage option, and it's poorly drained soil, but with drainage and no drainage gives you different recommendations. So you can kind of use selector tools to select your cover crop species that you can use in those low spots that tend to remain poorly drained. Okay. this is the last section that I'm going to talk about, kind of leading into what Brittany is going to talk to you about is how does drainage and cover crop interact? And I'm just mainly going to talk about the water balance part of this. Brittany will probably talk about this, but we're essentially looking at the data collected across 40 or more fields, agricultural fields across Ohio, mainly Northwest Ohio. Several years of data that goes into this. And here is how the water budget would look like for a typically drained field in Northwest Ohio. We get about 40 inches of rainfall. More than half of that actually finds its way back into the atmosphere in the form of evapotranspiration. About 30% of your annual precipitation is what you see at the tile outlet in the form of drainage discharge. Very small fraction of that actually runs off over the surface as a surface runoff, only maybe around 5% to 7%. But a majority of the water leaving your fields is going to be in the form of tile drainage is the message here. There is a huge variability across all those 40 fields, but in general, this is how the water budget looks like. Here is how water budget would look like for a typical cover cropped field. And this is just one field, very small window, but this was a white mustard cover crop. And we're looking at about a 3% share in the total water budget from the evapotranspiration losses that happen from that cover crop. It does have an effect on maybe the tile drainage component or the runoff component. Here is that same field in a different year. Or maybe a different field in the same year that had a different cover crop. And this is a rye cover crop, which tends to be more dense and has a lot more potential to evaporate water. So the evapotranspiration component becomes much more prominent, but still we're not talking about 30% of the water budget. It's still like 8%. So just know that cover crops do have a role that they play in the water balance per se. They would reroute the water from surface to subsurface and so on. But in Northwest Ohio, in our conditions in spring, not a lot of evapotranspiration that would happen. I think this is my segue slide for what Brittany is going to talk about. I do have a couple slides from my own research that I have done that talks about how long-term systems may have a different water quality signature, but I'll save that for Q&A if anyone has any questions on that. And that's my last slide.
Great. Thank you so much, Vinayak. I think that was really useful for a lot of us and a good segue into what Brittany's going to talk about. So again, any questions for Vinayak can go in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those at the end of the webinar. So now I'll turn it over to Brittany Hanrahan to share some of her findings.
Good morning, everyone. Let me just get to my presentation here really quickly. I apologize. Let's see. Are you seeing the presenter mode or the?
We are in the presentation mode. It looks good.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks, Vinayak, for sort of introducing that. And thank you all for attending the webinar today. And as Rachel said, my name is Brittany Hanrahan. I'm a research biologist with the USDA Soil Drainage Research Unit in Columbus, Ohio. And today I'm going to talk about primarily my own research. I'm not going to do a large overview. Hold on one second. I just want to make sure there's no, it looked like it just switched without me clicking. So let me make sure there's no timings on here. I apologize for that. Okay. Hopefully that doesn't do that again, but if it does, that's okay. All right, so I like to use a slide like this to begin my presentation because I think it's important to really step back and look at the broader picture. So nitrogen and phosphorus that are transported to downstream water bodies can degrade water quality and have negative environmental impacts. We know this because nitrogen and phosphorus are the primary nutrients that fuel algal blooms, and when these algal blooms die and decompose, oxygen is stripped from the water column.
Hey, Brittany,
Yeah.
we're not seeing your slides anymore.
Oh, no, sorry.
No
Goodness
problem.
gracious. My apologies here. I guess we should have done the practice, Rachel.
It's all good.
Okay, hopefully this works now.
Yes, we're seeing the editing mode right now.
Yep. Okay, great. Okay, so, oops. Okay, you can see the screen in presentation mode.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, nitrogen and phosphorus are fueling algal blooms. And when these algal blooms die and decompose, oxygen is stripped from the water column, and this causes areas of low oxygen called hypoxic zones. There are now more than 400 hypoxic zones around the world. You can see that in these red dots in this figure here. And we see this play out we've seen this play out in more recent years in Lake Erie each summer. And these blooms can negatively impact the ecosystem of the lake itself. So low oxygen conditions obviously have detrimental effects on the biological communities that live there, but they also negatively influence things like drinking water supplies and tourism just because of reduced aesthetics. So in the Western Lake Erie Basin and much of the Midwestern US, agricultural lands are often pointed to as the primary cause of algal blooms and water quality degradation. And that's because our current systems are inherently leaky. And this is for two main reasons. So the predominant summer crop rotation shortens our growing season to about 4 to 5 months. And the ground may look similar to this for the rest of the year, bare soil with little to no vegetation, which means little to no nutrient demand. And then the majority of nutrient export from agricultural systems occurs from January to June, when snow melts and seasonal precipitation patterns increase the amount of water moving through the systems, specifically these artificial drainage systems that we have. And this figure from a paper from Royer et al. 2006 shows cumulative nitrogen and phosphorus losses from an agricultural watershed in Illinois. And we see this really rapid increase in nutrient loss. I don't know if you can see, you probably can't see my pointer, from January to June, in this January to June period. And the take home from this is really that the critical times of nutrient export or nitrogen and phosphorus loss occur when soil is bare in agricultural systems. So cover crops are considered this important component of sustainable agricultural systems because they really work within the natural system to enhance ecosystem services, including water and nutrient demand. So planting cover crop after cash crop harvest replaces that bare soil with vegetation, effectively extending the growing season. And in doing so, cover crops then have the potential to take up and retain nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil profile during periods of the year when the ground would otherwise have been bare. So this demonstrates their potential to curb or reduce nitrogen and phosphorus losses. And indeed, field studies that have been conducted on experimental farms across the US, anywhere from Delaware to Ohio or to Iowa, have shown that tile drains can reduce nitrogen loss specifically by anywhere from 13 to 94%. And then studies examining the effects of cover crops on phosphorus loss, which is usually what we're worried about in the Western Lake Erie Basin, have reported mixed results. So some studies have reported decreased phosphorus loss, increased phosphorus loss, or really no effect. So with that in mind, our goal for the research project that I'm going to talk about here was to examine the effect of cover crops across the edge of field network, which Vinayak introduced here in North Central Ohio, and to answer two primary research questions. How do cover crops influence nitrogen and phosphorus loss in subsurface tile drainage and surface runoff? Although Vinayak showed us that surface runoff is a very small component, we still want to know how cover crops are impacting that. And then how does the signature of cover crops vary in time? So do we see a seasonal signature of cover crops? And then also between nutrient constituents, so between nitrogen and phosphorus. So Vinayak talked a little bit about this, and I'm sure many of you have seen this before. But our edge of field network is comprised of a series of agricultural fields with 40 sampling sites that include both subsurface tile drainage and surface runoff outlets. And these outlets are instrumented so that discharge and water quality measurements are collected on a near continuous basis, which allows us to estimate nitrogen and phosphorus losses from these agricultural fields. And then we also have management records from the producers, which detailed in this particular case, what we were interested in is the detail that was included whether a cover crop was planted near or after cash crop harvest. And this allowed us to categorize all of these sites in the edge of field network as a field with cover crop management or a field without cover crop management. And then for the purpose of this particular study, any crop that was planted outside of the cash crop growing season, so that May to October period, was classified as a cover crop. So the cover crop species included in this analysis were alfalfa, clover, hay, oats, mustard, radish, rye, wheat, and then mixtures of multiple species, because this spanned multiple years as well. So I'm going to present some results that address our first research question: how do cover crops influence nitrogen and phosphorus loss in subsurface tile drainage and surface runoff? I'm going to show a few of these graphs in the next few slides, and I really want to spend some time explaining how they are set up and setting the stage for examining patterns of tile and surface discharge. So these panels here show the time series of the response variable that we're interested in, which in this case is discharge. We have tile drainage in the top figure and surface runoff in the bottom figure. And then fields without cover crops are shown in gray, and fields with cover crop are shown in blue, or the dots are blue. So what we can see from these plots is that monthly discharge from both subsurface and surface is generally less from fields with cover crops than fields without. So the blue dots are generally falling below the gray dots. And then these panels on the right are showing the overall average of the monthly discharge for fields without cover crops, again in gray, and fields with cover crops, again in blue. So when I say overall, it's because this is estimating the average for fields without and with cover crops across the entire period of record. So all of those dots that are in those left-hand panels. And I just want to note that we used a statistical model to estimate these averages, accounting for site-to-site variability, and then the fact that we collect measurements from the same locations over time. So it was a really robust statistical analysis. And these plots here show, on the right-hand side, show the comparison that we're primarily interested in for the purpose of our first research question. And what we can see is that average monthly tile discharge was about 3% less from fields with cover crops, while average monthly surface discharge was about 2% less from fields with cover crops. So really in line with what Vinayak was just showing us with his water budget analysis. But importantly, these differences were not statistically significant, indicating that cover crops did not strongly alter the amount of tile or surface discharge leaving agricultural fields. So it wasn't having a huge impact on the amount of water. We followed the same procedure, first plotting a time series of nutrient losses and then comparing average monthly totals over the entire period of record for nitrogen and phosphorus in both subsurface tile and surface runoff pathways. So these figures here show average monthly tile nitrate on the top and tile total nitrogen on the bottom. And what we can see is that, again, average monthly totals of tile nitrate and total nitrogen were consistently less from fields with cover crops in these red dots compared to fields without cover crops, again in the gray. And when we compare the average monthly totals over the period of record, we found that nitrate and total nitrogen loads were about 50% less from fields with cover crops than fields without cover crops. Or thought of in another way, fields with cover crops were retaining 50% more nitrogen than fields without. And now we're looking at plots of average monthly totals of surface nitrate and surface total nitrogen. So nitrate again is on the top and total nitrogen is on the bottom. And in general, nitrogen losses and surface runoff are quite low. It does appear that both nitrate and total nitrogen losses are generally less from fields with cover crop management than fields without. And when we compared these average monthly totals over the period of record, we did find that there was a 9% decrease in nitrates, surface nitrate losses, and a 6% decrease in total nitrogen losses from fields with cover crops to fields without cover crops. But again, these were not statistically significant. So there was not a strong influence of cover crops on nitrogen loss and surface runoff. You can also see that these values, this 9% and the 6%, are substantially less than the percent reductions from tile that we saw on the previous slide, which I think really underscores the effect that cover crops can have on nitrogen loads from tile drainage systems specifically, and really demonstrates the utility of cover crops as a conservation practice to mitigate subsurface end losses, which Vinayak already showed us is the primary loss pathway for many of the fields across this EduField network. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears and talk about the results for phosphorus. And here we have the time series of monthly averages for tile dissolved reactive phosphorus, DRP, on the top, and tile total phosphorus, TP, on the bottom. And these time series really reveal less consistent results compared to nitrogen. For example, you can see there are some cases or some months when the orange dots are above the gray dots, and some instances where the gray dots are above the orange dots, or in some cases where the orange and the gray dots are really just right on top of each other. So when we compared the average monthly totals over the entire period of record, we actually found that tile DRP and TP loads were about 7% and 2% greater from fields with cover crops than fields without cover crops. There was a lot of variability in this data, which is why we have these sort of larger error bars, the lines that are on either side of the individual dots in this right-hand panel. But we also saw that this was not statistically different. So technically, crops were not having a strong influence on tile phosphorus loss from the agricultural fields in the edge of field network. Now we're looking at the time series for average monthly totals of surface DRP and surface TP. Surface DRP is on the top and surface TP is on the bottom. We see similarly inconsistent results where the orange dots are sometimes above the gray dots or sometimes below the gray dots. But in general, it seems that monthly totals of both DRP and TP are greater from fields without cover crops than fields with cover crops. And that is what we saw when we looked at the average monthly totals over the entire period of record. So cover crops, fields with cover crops had 16% lower DRP losses in surface runoff and about 29% lower TP losses in surface runoff. Again, however, this was not statistically significant, again, because of this large variability with the larger error bars. So we can conclude that cover crops did not strongly influence phosphorus loss in surface runoff. So I just went through a lot of information, and to really bring this all together, I've made a table summarizing the percent change for each response variable in tile drainage in the left-hand columns and in surface runoff in the right-hand columns. So I've tried to estimate what the difference in average monthly totals over the period of record may translate to in pounds per acre per year, the mass loss that might be retained on the field or prevented from being lost. So cover crops only significantly influence tile nitrate and total nitrogen, essentially reducing nitrogen losses by about 18 to 19 pounds per acre per year, meaning that mass of N remained in the fields instead of being lost. We can also see that reductions in tile nitrate and tile TN were much, much greater than the slight, and again, not significant increases in tile DRP and TP in percent, but also perhaps most importantly in the actual mass that was lost from the individual fields. And reductions in surface DRP and TP were also greater than the increases in tile DRP and TP. So these results really demonstrate that one, cover crops are an effective management tool for reducing nitrogen loss from agricultural fields in Ohio. And two, while trends for phosphorus were not statistically significant, the overall effect of cover crops may still be positive or may be a benefit given reductions in surface runoff. But it's really important to understand the dominant pathway of loss from an individual field. So that remains critical when weighing the benefits and costs of planting cover crops, for phosphorus especially. So now we're going to think about how the signature of cover crops may vary in time and between nutrient constituents. So again, I'm just going to set the stage with discharge results because we know there is a strong relationship between discharge and nutrient loading. And to orient you to these figures, the x-axes here are months beginning in October and ending in September, following the water year. And then the y-axes are median monthly tile discharge on the left and median monthly surface discharge on the right. And the median is just another version of an average value. It's just the middle value in your rankings of your data. So median monthly discharge from fields without cover crops, again, are shown in gray, and median monthly discharge from fields with cover crops are shown in blue. So we found that monthly tile discharge was less from fields with cover crops in April, May, and June, but greater from fields with cover crops in August and September. And this suggests that fields with cover crops had reduced tile flow in the spring, but greater tile flow in the summer. Again, we really need a lot more research to quantify these water dynamics in fields, and that's where we really appreciate some of the work that Vinayak is doing on that. In contrast, we saw no significant difference in surface runoff between fields with and without cover crops. So cover crops weren't influencing the amount of water leaving fields in surface runoff. So I'm showing you these same plots, but for tile nitrate on the top and tile total nitrogen on the bottom. In comparison to tile discharge, we found that tile nitrate and total nitrogen loads were significantly less from fields with cover crops compared to fields without cover crops, indicated by these red stars on top of these comparisons, in December through June. So this really demonstrated that cover crops were effectively reducing nitrogen loss from fall to spring. Differences during these months ranged anywhere from 0.7 to 2.3 pounds per acre. And this is particularly important because these are also the months when cover crops, these months when cover crops are significantly reducing N loss coincide with times of the year when nutrient export from agricultural fields to downstream waters is greatest. So they're effectively working at the time that we need them to be working. Again, we saw that cover crops generally did not influence monthly nitrogen losses in surface runoff, and surface runoff losses for both nitrate and TN were really quite low compared to tile. So shifting to tile DRP on the top here and tile TP on the bottom, we found that median monthly tile DRP and TP loads were significantly greater from fields with cover crops than fields without cover crops in January, March, and July through September. These differences were very small. This, increase in mass loss ranged anywhere from 0.01 to 0.3 pounds per acre. And then the surface results also showed greater DRP and TP and surface runoff from fields with cover crops in some winter and summer months. So the trends were a little bit less consistent, but we still saw this increase from fields with cover crops. So here, there are a couple things that are important to note about this particular analysis. One, it's less robust than the one that I showed you in the first few sets of slides. But it's important to think about this temporal series and when cover crops might be actually effectively working or not effectively working. And then in the case of our particular fields, it's also really important to note that average STP was greater from fields with cover crops than fields without cover crops. So we really need a better understanding of if the increases that we are seeing here are truly a cover crop effect, or if they're related to some other field or management characteristics, or if it's some combination of those two things. So we really need some side-by-side comparisons in the edge of field network to look at how cover crops are impacting phosphorus loss specifically, and the time series of phosphorus loss from individual fields. Okay. So again, I've attempted to make sort of a summary table here, describing the general trends in different months and summing the differences in nitrogen and phosphorus loss among months to estimate the magnitude of increase or decrease over the course of a theoretical year. And we know that cover crops appear to be working, quote unquote, to retain nitrogen during the cover crop growing season. And again, this is important because it coincides with critical times of nutrient export. Increases in phosphorus loss are occurring inconsistently throughout the year. So they're not really, they're not focused or isolated to one particular season. And what this suggests to me is that we don't really know what mechanisms this might be related to. So understanding if it's freeze-thaw cycles, if it's preferential flow, if it's related to management, is something that we really need to look into and understand more. But we can see that the mass of N saved or retained was much, much greater than the mass of P lost, the mass of phosphorus lost. So again, understanding the resource of concern, whether we're more worried about nitrogen or phosphorus, and then any site or management specific characteristics is critically important to what cover crops are going to really do on an individual field. I've already made some conclusions about each of our main research questions. So just to really bring this all home, I want to examine some hypothetical plots of cumulative NMP losses to help us summarize what we might expect or predict based on our results. So the x-axis here is time during the water year from October to September. And the y-axis is cumulative nitrogen loss, which would be calculated by accumulating the daily sums of nitrogen loss until we reach the total annual loss in a given year. And for fields without cover crops, we can see that cumulative N loss increases rapidly, denoted by this steep incline during times of bare soil, basically from that January to June timeframe. And in comparison, the cumulative N loss curve for fields with cover crops is considerably dampened. The magnitude and accumulation of nitrogen losses are sort of dramatically decreased relative to fields without cover crops, again, shown in that gray line. So where the endpoint of this red line may fall, it'll increase or decrease depending on other management practices and environmental drivers, things like extreme precipitation. But there's strong evidence from this study and then many others that cover crops effectively reduce nitrogen loss from agricultural fields. Cumulative P losses in fields without cover crops follow a similar pattern with a steep increase during times of bare soil. But when we layer cumulative P losses from fields with cover crops on top of this, we can see a few things. So intrinsic field properties matter. We had a higher starting point where the orange line was above the gray line to begin with. And that really is because fields with cover crops in this particular instance, in this analysis, had greater STP. So there was a larger pool of phosphorus to be lost from those fields in the first place. And this also shows that small increases in phosphorus. So I kept mentioning that the magnitude of mass loss difference between fields with and without cover crops was very small. But those small increases can aggregate to very large differences over time. And this is important because that does have impacts on adjacent and downstream freshwater systems. And then again, similar to nitrogen, where the endpoint of cumulative P loss ends up is going to differ. It may increase or decrease depending on a variety of things. The pathway that we're focusing on, whether we're thinking about tile or surface, the phosphorus species that we're looking at, whether it's dissolved reactive phosphorus or total phosphorus, and then other factors such as management practices like fertilizer source, application method, timing, cover crop species, all of those things will play a role in where that endpoint actually falls. Okay, if I still have a few minutes, I just wanted to shift gears and briefly talk about some of my previous work in the Shadow Ditch watershed in Kosciuszko County, Indiana. Just because we finished looking at results from tile drain and surface runoff outlets, which reflect changes from individual fields, and this remains an extremely important area of research. However, we also know very little about the effects that planting many fields and cover crops might have on water quality. So to examine this, we designed an experiment where cover crop acreage was increased from less than 12% of a 1,300 hectare watershed to greater than 67% of the acreage. And our primary research question was, how will shifting land cover from bare soil to cover crops at a large spatial scale impact nutrient export in an agricultural watershed? And our hypothesis was that increasing nutrient retention within these fields, within many fields, would reduce loss to the adjacent waterway. So to determine the effect of cover crops at the watershed scale, we collected water samples from tile drains, which I'm not going to talk about today, but also from the base of the watershed. And importantly, this work was building on previously published research from the lab that I was in when I did this work. So we had a record of the pre-cover crop conditions since 2007, and then we had our post-cover crop conditions later on. This is a lot of data, so I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but I'm really just showing you the period of record that we had is pre-cover crop period from 2008 to 2013, and the post-cover crop period from 2014 to 2016. That BRH is just where I started sampling, so I was part of both the pre and post-cover crop years. The blue is discharge that was measured in the stream. The green dots are nitrate concentration samples that were collected from the stream, and the orange dots are soluble reactive phosphorus or dissolved reactive phosphorus concentrations that were also collected from the stream. We can see that there's a lot of interannual variability in both discharge and nutrient concentrations, and in general, nitrate was greater than soluble reactive or dissolved reactive phosphorus concentrations. And in general, high concentrations of both of these coincided with high flows. So our goal was to examine changes in watershed export. So we needed to use these biweekly grab samples to estimate daily NNP loss, which is what I was showing you in all of the previous slides. So in order to do this, we estimated daily nitrate and DRP concentration and then multiplied daily concentration by daily discharge to get a daily load value. And that's what I'm showing you here in this lower figure. This is the actual nitrate export and phosphorus export, again in orange and green respectively, from the watershed. Again, we have these this high interannual variability and really strong seasonal patterns of elevated export during the spring, which is common in agricultural watersheds. And then we divided these daily export values by watershed area in order to compare yield or mass loss, which we aggregated over the course of a year to compare annual values. And when we did this, we saw that average annual nitrate loss from the watershed was about 19 kilograms of nitrate per hectare, or 41 pounds of nitrate per hectare during the pre-cover crop period, and about 17 kilograms per hectare, or 37 pounds per hectare during the post-cover crop period. So this indicated a slight decrease in watershed nitrate export during years that were planted in watershed scale cover crops, but this was not statistically significant. And we saw a similar trend where average annual total DRP export was lower in post-cover crop years by about 30%. But again, this was not statistically significant, primarily because we had huge variability in flow and a lot more flow or a lot of greater flow instances during the post-cover crop period than the pre-cover crop period. So we needed to find a way to account for variability in flow in order to really isolate the effect of cover crops on watershed export. We did this by using something called the flow duration curve analysis, which really just relates flow values or discharge values to the percent of time those values have been met or exceeded. So really high flows occur really rarely or infrequently. So they would fall within this less than 10% of the time on the far side of this particular figure. So we compared when we plotted the flow duration curves for pre-cover crop years, that 2008 to 2013 period, and post-cover crop years, 2014 to 2016, we found that the curves looked very similar. So we were able to compare essentially watershed export during these high flow and moist conditions, when we found that about 70% of nitrate export and about 90% of DRP or SRP export was occurring. And what we saw from this was that daily nitrate export or yield was about 18% lower in high flows and 20% lower in moist conditions during post-cover crop years. So cover crops were helping to dampen nutrient losses during extreme events. And we saw the same trend or a similar trend for SRP or DRP yield or export, which was 20% decrease during high flows and 39% decrease during these moist conditions. So the take home from this is really that when we weren't able to determine the effect of cover crops when we looked at nitrogen and phosphorus export at the annual scale, but we did find that cover crops appear to be effectively reducing both nitrogen and phosphorus losses during extreme flow events, these really high flows that occur infrequently, but are responsible for the majority of nutrient export in agricultural watersheds. So again, this is probably an important consideration given that climate change is predicted to increase the frequency and intensity of storms in the Midwestern US. So cover crops may be a tool that we can use to sort of help mitigate those effects. So all in all, the work that this work revealed that increasing vegetative land cover through the planting of cover crops also increased nitrogen and phosphorus retention in the watershed. So cover crops are effectively working for nitrogen and phosphorus export in the watershed and at the field scale. With that, I just want to say thank you and happy to take any questions. Landowners, all of the field technicians.
Great, thank you so much, Brittany. That was fantastic. I'm going to share screen again now, and we'll get started with the Q&A session. So the first question, and the only one we have right now in the Q&A, looks like it's for Brittany. So if there's any other questions, feel free to drop those in the Q&A. But the question is, were the results shared in your presentation from a diverse mix of cover crops, or were they all grasses or legumes at each site? And is there a potential difference between cover crop species in regards to potential decreases in DRP losses?
Yes, this is a great question. And we do get it a lot, asking about cover crop species. So the analysis that I showed from Ohio covered all of the cover crop species that were planted in fields from about 2012, 2013 through, I think, 2019 was the end of the period of record for that particular paper. So it essentially was looking at the average effect of cover crop, but that cover crop could have been anything. So we did not specifically identify species. We didn't drop any particular species. We didn't focus on any particular species. We just wanted to look at the effect of having some sort of plant vegetation in a field during the non-cash crop growing season. So no particular focus on species. The work that I showed you from Shadow Ditch Watershed, that was all grasses. And in that particular paper, we did find a decrease in phosphorus losses when we looked at individual fields. And then of course, the watershed that I showed you as well. And that work is published. I'm happy to provide the paper if anyone is interested. But that was all annual ryegrass. So that was a particular case where we had a farmer and a soil and water conservation district board that was super passionate about a strong experimental design and pushed for one cover crop species that allowed us to really look at the effect of just that one species. So the long and short, I guess that's a long-winded answer, but are still more analyses that can be done. We can still look at cover crop species with the information that Kevin's group has collected from all of these fields. It's just something that hasn't been done yet.
Okay, great.
I'll just add to that, I guess, in addition to that cover crop species being important, I also know that, the establishment from one year to another can be very different, and that also plays a role. And those two factors I don't think Brittany had considered in her analysis, or I have, but not considered in my analysis.
Okay.
Yeah, we didn't do anything where we looked at, yeah, that's right, Vinayak. We didn't do anything where we actually looked at biomass, which is super important, and planting data is super important, all of those things. It was accounted for, like that type of variability was accounted for in our statistical model, but it was certainly not something that we focused particularly in on. So yes, that's a good point.
Okay, and we just had another question come in. I'm assuming this is about the studies you mentioned, Brittany, but it's asking any measurements of soil health, such as aggregate stability, soil carbon, or organic matter, and their impact on TP and DRP loss.
We do have all of these measurements. No one has looked at it yet. I'm a stream ecologist, so I tend to focus on the water, but we obviously have soil scientists in our unit that have collected all of this data, and it is certainly something that we could look at. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I did have a question for Amber. So thinking about kind of your talk and what you covered today, what would be your number one piece of advice when planning out a herbicide program when using a cover crop mix of species?
If you're going to look at using some kind of mix, I would generally have an idea of what kind of mix you want to use, what are the species, and then if you have your herbicide plan for the year, or at least what cash crop you're going to grow, what its traits are, if it's Roundup Ready, Liberty, whatever it's going to be. That way you can kind of plan out what herbicide you're going to use and look at the timings of approximately when you would apply, so you could get an idea of what if you harvest on time in a perfect scenario, could I plant my species at this time and have no issues with the herbicides I applied this year? So it's basically just try and plan out your entire year, which is hard to do, I understand, depending on the weather conditions, but kind of have a general idea of what the plan for the year looks like herbicide wise and cover crop species wise to make sure there's no interactions.
Great. I do have one question for Vinayak, but before I go into that, I'm going to put up the CCA credit slide. So if you are a certified crop advisor and you need credits for this webinar, open up your CCA app on your phone and scan this QR code. If you have any issues with that, send me an email and I can try to help you get those added after the webinar. My email is on the screen here. And then if you are a CLM and you need CLM credits, I'm going to launch a new poll that just says yes or no, and answer that poll yes if you need credits. Let me just get that pulled up here. Okay. So continuing on with our Q&A session, Vinayak, do you have any information about whether or not there's a difference in the proportion of farms that use tile drainage between farms that use cover crops and farms that don't use cover crops, or I guess any guesses about the distribution there?
You mean the cover crop acreage?
Yeah, like the
across state.
proportion of those farmers who use drainage.
Well, it's fair to assume that, yeah, I don't have the numbers per se, but, yeah, my assumption would be any crop production that we're doing here in Northwest Ohio, any piece of land has to have some kind of drainage improvement that was applied in the last 200 years. And that same assumption goes with the cover crop acreage. The cover crop acreage in Ohio has grown over the last decade or so. It's almost doubled with all the different efforts, and I don't have the exact numbers on there. But let's just say not all cover crops are on drained land, but a majority of them are on drained land.
Okay. And then it is 11:30, so we understand if you have to jump off, but we did just have one more question come into the Q&A. So I'm thinking this is probably for Brittany, but based on the results shared with later termination of cover crops after the cash crop is planted, hopefully help minimize water flow during those heavy rain events, leading to less total phosphorus being lost.
So this is a good question. I think one important thing to highlight here is that total phosphorus loss tends to be lower with cover crops because of the surface roughness that they add to a system, right? So they're sort of stopping or at least retaining or reducing the sediment associated phosphorus that's transported on the surface. So in general, the component of phosphorus that we worry about or is of concern with cover crops would be dissolved reactive phosphorus. I am not an agronomist, so I'm not going to try to wade into an area of when to terminate something. But I think allowing for the cover crop to be on the ground as long as possible does a lot of provides a lot of benefit in terms of reducing nutrient loss through that increased nutrient demand. I don't know if that answers your question specifically. It probably doesn't. But I think a later termination date allows for the cover crop to retain those nutrients longer.
Okay. I think this webinar has been great. Thank you so much for all of our speakers and all of the time you put into these presentations and the Q&A session here. Right before we close out the webinar, I do just want to remind everyone our final Water Quality Wednesday is next month at 10 to 11:30 a.m. March 29th. So please join us for that as well. And again, thank you so much to all of our presenters and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.